Now let's talk about time management. This is an extremely important topic in selling. The reason for that is Cutco is not like other jobs, and I know you know that. I mean, your manager's deeply invested in your success. You get paid for the results that you bring to the table as opposed to being paid for your time, which at the end of the day, that means that you're the one writing your own paychecks. And you don't have to clock in and clock out. And what that really means is you want to be able to manage your own time. And it's the same thing being a student. That transition from high school to college, you go from high school, which is very clock in and clock out, to college, which has these classes where half the time the professor doesn't even take attendance. So time management can be an extremely valuable skill. And this goes way beyond selling knives. Tony Robbins says that there's 3 things that consistently demand our focus when we don't plan. The first is fear. When we don't make plans, we avoid anything that we believe has the potential to give us pain. You ever had that happen where you're avoiding something because at some level you're afraid of it? And it might not even be a really, really deep fear. Maybe it's just something simple like you're avoiding having a conversation with someone because you think it might be difficult. Or you're avoiding studying for a test because you're not 100% sure if you could pass it or not, or because you're having more fun on a computer game or hanging out with your friends. The second is pleasure. Many people live their lives in such an extreme state of stress that they simply long for a sense of relief. So what gets our attention? Little things that make us feel good immediately. Like having something to eat or drink or smoke. And I'm getting this straight out of a Tony Robbins program called The Time of Your Life. Or we do something that we know will give us an immediate sense of accomplishment, like cleaning off our desk rather than working on a report or a project. You ever do that, where you organize your desk when you really should be studying or working on something else? The third thing is other people's demands. And at the end of the day, that's really another form of pain. We don't want to disappoint people. And we know that in order to maintain relationships with people, we have to meet their needs. But at the end of the day, when we're not planning things, when we're disorganized, when we don't manage our time, we're looking for other people to motivate us. And we're being motivated by what other people want. And a lot of times they don't want what's best for us. Or even if they do want what they think is best for us, that might not be what we think is best for us. Again, this goes back to living life on your own terms. In order to do that, you have to be able to manage your time. In fact, take a moment. Make a list of all the ways in which poor time management has hurt you in the past. And if you're driving or if you're jogging, just think about this for a moment. What has it cost you? You ever had that time where you forgot an anniversary? Or you forgot the birthday of someone important to you? You ever show up in class and realize that there's a quiz or a test that everyone else knew about except for you? Show up late to practice because you thought that it started at a certain time and started at a different time? In fact, John Berghoff once gave me a challenge, and I'm going to give it to you. Find a problem in your life that would still be there even if you had planned well for it. Or find a problem that would not be improved by careful planning. Think about that for a minute. Try to find even one problem in your life that would still be there if you had planned well for it. Now, the first and most important key to managing your time is get a planner. I don't know of anyone, inside or even outside Vector, who's truly successful who uses only an electronic planner. And I don't know anyone who's even modestly successful who doesn't use a planner. I know some people who use a combination of electronic and handwritten planners. In fact, I do that myself. You can use something like Google Calendars for long-term and for email reminders and things like that. Or they'll use a system like IS2 for various reminders or for customer database management or things like that. But when it comes to what am I doing today, what am I doing this week, what am I doing next week, almost everyone that I can think of uses a handwritten planner of some kind. So get a planner. They're not very expensive. You can get them at any office supply store. And you want to get one that has spaces large enough in the days for you to be able to put your appointments and your classes and other things in them. So get a planner. If you do not have one now, I would immediately make that a top priority. Once you have a planner, your next step is to start doing a weekly hour of power. Now, the hour of power is the time every week when you plan your week. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to be exactly an hour. For some of us, it might be 20 minutes. For some of us, it might be 30. It might be an hour and a half. It might be 2 hours. It might be 3 or 4 hours. But most of the time, it's going to be approximately an hour when you sit down and you list all of the things that need to happen in a week. You look at your long-term schedule, which if you're a student, which means looking at the syllabuses that you have, looking at any sort of sports you're involved in, other organizations that you're committed to. You look at when the weekly team meeting is, when push periods are, when division meetings are, all of that stuff as far as the vector calendar goes. And then you plan when you're going to get everything done. One phrase you might want to adopt that I've heard many successful people say is, if it's not in my schedule, it doesn't exist. Now, obviously it does exist if it's not in your schedule, but the point there is that when we don't write things down, they tend to not happen. They've done studies on this that show that if someone commits to something, then there's a certain percent chance that they'll do it, and it's usually pretty low. If someone commits to something and says when they'll do it, then the chance increases greatly. And the highest chances when they commit to do it, they commit to doing it at a specific time, and they actually write it down. When it's in a planner, it's hard to miss. Once you've got your planner, once you've started doing your weekly hour of power, one of the first things you probably want to do in your first hour of power, which will probably take a little bit longer than the rest of them, is to actually sit down and schedule the next several hours of power. Because what will happen is you sit down, you have your first hour of power, you schedule out a week, you go out, you have a great week, and then you forget the next hour of power, and then the next week isn't planned and it completely falls apart. The best way to do it is to have the hour of power at the same time every week if you can. Every Sunday evening, every Sunday morning, every Monday morning, whatever day seems right to you. But developing habits is a lot easier than remembering to do things. Most of us who keep personal hygiene don't need a ton of reminders to brush our teeth and to take regular showers because we're in that habit. If you can put your hour of power in that category, it's going to be one of those things that fuels everything else for you. I have frequently found that whenever my week is falling apart, it's because I skipped that hour of power. And the next thing that you want to start doing is you want to keep a capture list with you everywhere you go. This is either a section in your planner or a Word document or a notepad or something on your mobile device, your smartphone, or a small journal or a small notebook that you take with you everywhere. The best place to put it is probably your smartphone. And it's just a running to-do list. Every time you think of something that needs to get done, you put it on the capture list. That way, if you're running on the treadmill and you remember, oh no, I got to talk to my mom about blank. If you don't write that down, later you're going to be wondering, I was supposed to talk to my mom about something. I was supposed to talk to my mom. What was it? And then it's going to start bugging you, and then you're trying to enjoy a movie, or you're trying to have fun with your friends, or you're trying to do phone time, and you keep thinking about, what was it that I was supposed to do? And then you remember and you realize that it wasn't even really that big a deal in the first place. But if you commit it to the capture list, you're on the treadmill, you grab your smartphone, you grab your little list, and you just write it down real quick. Then when you have your hour of power, the first place you go is your capture list. You say, oh yeah, I got to talk to my mom about this thing. Having a capture list can be extremely powerful, and it's a great stress reliever as well, because one of the biggest things that stresses us out is fearing that we're going to forget things. Plus, the act of writing these things down gets them out of your head. A few more tips about time management, a few more things that I actually learned from one of my first coaches, one of my first mentors, John Berghoff. The first is that the further ahead you plan, the more inspired you are. I'll say that again. The further ahead you plan, the more inspired you are. And, in general, the more money you make. I learned this from Matthew Kelly. Think about it for a minute. The person working at McDonald's, who flips burgers, who's making minimum wage, they get paid to manage a very small amount of time. They get paid to manage their shift. So they have to be responsible for what happens during their shift on their particular project. Then there's a person above them who's making minimum wage plus probably maybe 50% more than minimum wage. Some sort of assistant manager or maybe an overall general manager for that particular location. And that manager gets paid to manage about a week at a time. That manager sets shifts for the other employees about a week, maybe 2 weeks at a time. Then there's going to be an owner above that person who gets paid to manage probably anywhere from 6 to 18 months at a time. That's usually the type of time frame that an owner of a small franchise like that's going to be looking at. But if they own multiple franchises, then they're probably going to be thinking in other words, multiple locations. They're probably going to be thinking in terms of 2, 3, 5, maybe 7 years at a time. And the further you move up the chain, eventually you get to the CEO or the president of the company, the chairman of the board. And this person gets paid huge amounts of money to think about what's the future of that particular company, what's the future of McDonald's over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. What are we doing now that's going to create long-term growth over the next several decades? It's the same with your own personal life. The further ahead you plan, the more inspired you are. If you're living day to day to day, that's not very inspiring. You wake up one morning, you think, what am I going to do today? And you don't even have a plan? Well, on the one hand, there's a lot of freedom in that, and that can be fun. On the other hand, there's not a lot of vision. There's not a lot of places that type of life is going. Don't get me wrong. I'm all for freedom. I love hanging out, and I love days. They don't happen very often, but I do have days where I wake up and I have nothing to do, and it can be a ton of fun. But it's the exception, not the rule. I want to know what I'm doing because I want to be living life on my terms. And that is one of the big things that time management is about. It's about being in charge of your life. So I usually plan about 18 to 24 months ahead. That's what I'm usually thinking. But if you start thinking, what do you want your life to be like in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years? That's where you really start getting inspired. Another thing about time management that I learned from John Berghoff is when you think about time management, it sounds kind of strange. Like, what does it mean to manage time? It's this thing that it just happens. It's not something you can slow down or speed up. So how are you managing time at all? At the end of the day, time management is really about decision management and emotional management. Managing time poorly is really a problem of making the wrong decisions. It's also an emotional issue of either not staying focused or not feeling good about an activity or task, and therefore you avoid it. You want your emotions to work for you, not the other way around. Your emotions should serve the purposes that you set out for your life, not you serving your emotions, being a slave to your anger or frustration or boredom or whatever it is. I know that may sound a little bit strange because most people think that emotions are just something that kind of happens to you. But that's not the case. The way we think creates our emotions. And this is the entire basis of cognitive psychology, which is widely known to be one of the most effective treatments for both anxiety and depression. They've done numerous studies of this. The way we think has a massive impact on the way we feel. And so when we don't feel good about what we're doing, or when we start losing focus on a task, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail on this, but it's real simple. A lot of times, it really comes down to a lack of purpose in the task. We forget why we're doing it, or we don't know why we're doing it. So if you find yourself having trouble with time management, or managing your decisions, or your emotions, a lot of times it comes down to, what is the reason I'm doing this? I know you've been in that place before where you were focused, where you were committed, where it just felt like everything was clicking. And maybe it was you were only there for a few minutes. And maybe you were there for a week or even for an entire semester or for a whole sports season. But it clicks that way because you are aligned. You're aligned with your purpose. You know why you're doing what you're doing. Because when you have that clarity of purpose, time management is usually not that difficult. Because the strategy behind time management is very simple. It's a psychology that becomes more difficult. And we'll talk more about that in later levels. But for now, get a planner, do a weekly hour of power, and remember why you're doing what you're doing. A few more tips. If you're part of a larger organization, like your district office or division, or like a university or college, or like a club sports team. Or if you have some sort of big long-term project, like you're writing a book, or for me, working on these kits, you'll usually have some sort of separate document that details the schedule for that organization or for that particular project, the planning for that project. Part of your weekly hour of power should be double-checking those schedules. And when you first get that schedule, and if you're a student, that means the first day of class, when you get the syllabus, one of the first things you want to do is sit down with your calendar and look at when all the important dates are for that particular class. You also want to look at how much time you'll need to prepare for those important dates. So if you know when your exam is, how much time in advance do you want to start preparing for the exam? How much time do you want to write your term paper? So if the term paper is due on May 14th and you know you want 2 weeks, then write on May 1st, start term paper. Put that in your schedule, even if it's January. That way when May 1st rolls around, you can start getting ready. This can be extremely valuable. The same thing goes for your district or your division in Vector. Ask your manager, what are the important dates for the rest of the summer, for the rest of the fall, for the rest of the spring that I need to know about? Are there division meetings? When are the conferences? Things like that. Now, another big problem in time management is perfectionism. Perfectionism wastes time. And it also generates huge amounts of stress, and it can contribute to procrastination. Because you start procrastinating, because you know you have to do a project, and you know you have to do it perfectly, and you're afraid that maybe you can't do it perfectly, so you start putting it off. Here's the thing, nothing is ever perfect. So one of my mentors, Tony Robbins, he always says, people who say that their standard is perfection. That's a standard that they're never going to reach, and most of them know that they can never reach it. So what that means is they have no standard. Perfectionism is no standard. Another way to think about perfectionism is, if you use like a military analogy, it's like committing all of your forces to your frontline defense. All of your forces. Here's the problem with that. If your frontline defense is breached just one time, you lose the entire battle because you have no backup reinforcements whatsoever, and the enemy breaks through, and the whole line falls apart as people try to chase the enemy, and it turns into a complete and total rout. A disaster. Think of it this way. If you're dieting, and you say, I will absolutely, under no circumstances whatsoever, I will not eat any cookies. Well, that's fine as long as it lasts. But then one day you're really stressed, or you're really tired, or you've had a long day, or you're out with friends, or you're at a party, and then you see those cookies, and you eat one, and you're like, oh man, I ate one cookie. I knew I wasn't going to eat a cookie. I was not supposed to do that. And then you say, you know what, 2 cookies isn't that different from eating one. So then you eat 2, and you're like, you know what, 3's not that. And then all of a sudden, by the time you're done, you've eaten all the cookies, and you're thinking, you know what, I already ate the cookies. I might as well have some ice cream too. And the next day, you're like, well, I skipped the diet yesterday, so maybe I can skip it. I'll start it next week. And then all of a sudden, you push it off. Whereas when you're more flexible with things, you're like, oh, I had a cookie. It's not that big a deal. And then you can go right back to your diet. So avoid perfectionism as much as you possibly can. It creates stress, and stress makes it harder to manage your decisions, which makes it harder to manage your time. And it can also contribute to procrastination, like I said. I'll close this section on time management with a story. A father wants to teach his son about time management. So he says to his son, I'd like to show you something. And he gets out a bucket. And he says, this bucket represents the amount of time that you have in a week. And he pulls out a bunch of big rocks. And he takes these big rocks and he fills the bucket with big rocks. And he says to his son, now, look at this bucket. Is it full yet? The son says, of course it's full. And the father says, are you sure? And he says, yeah, it's full. You can't put any more big rocks in it. So then the father pulls out a bag of pebbles. And he takes the pebbles and he sprinkles them on. And of course they fall in the spaces in between the big rocks until the space is filled to the top with pebbles. And he says, now is it full? And the kid's thinking, yeah, you tricked me. He says, yes, it's full now. So then the dad pulls out a bag of sand. And he pours sand in, and the sand seeps into the spaces
in between the pebbles. He says, what do you think? Is it full now? And his son says, I'm going to guess not, but it sure looks full to me. I mean, I don't know. What could you possibly put more in there? But I already thought that, so I don't know. So then the dad pulls out a large container of water. And he pours water in, and the water seeps in between the big rocks, in between the pebbles, and in between the sand until it's completely full to the brim with water. And the dad says, now it's full. And he says to his son, what do you think the lesson is? And the son says, that there's always more time in the week than you think there is? And the dad says, well, that may be true. Usually there is more time than we think there is. But the real lesson is to watch your rocks. You can only put so many large rocks in this bucket. Your large rocks are the things that take up the largest amount of time in your week. So be careful what your rocks are.